All right, everybody. So welcome back to another day in the practical web dev space, right? So we're here because we want to find more opportunities to get into the modern full stack development landscape. And I'm here to help y'all as a guide because, yeah, learning web development these days is not easy because there's just so much going on, right? So just making sense of the landscape. Finding your footing, getting started with things. That is my goal, to make it a little bit easier. And today we're going to keep talking about React, like we've been talking about these last couple of sessions, and hopefully get a solid kind of practical entry to React for real. So we've been working on a lot of smaller little applications that definitely have introduced us to the concepts we need. We talked a little bit about all the JavaScript that really comes up when we're working with React, things like functions, things like working with arrays and objects, and creating variables, and importing and exporting that data from file to file, right? And all of that is definitely still going to be at play. But in what I'd like to do going forward is just kind of try to build out little applications that have a bit more utility to them, I suppose, so that we can actually see how we would use React in a actual use case, right? And so that's my goal. Today, we're going to keep talking about some of the things we were talking about before, talk about components, talk about JSX, talk about props, and hopefully get into another concept that is also very important with working with React, called state. So that is my goal. If you're ready to rock with your boy, just give me a thumbs up, drop something in the chat, send me some love, you know what I'm saying? Send me a carrier pigeon with your well tidings, and let's make it happen. All right. I love it. I love it. Let's do it. Cool. So we've been working on a project. We've been working on our first React application. So I'll just share my screen and talk us through what's going on with that. And the application is here, our first React application, right? And we created this application using the Create React App toolchain, which initialized all of our project files for us, right? We talked a couple sessions ago about all of these files, what they all meant, and what they did for the application. And I told y'all that there were a couple of files that are extremely important, and then other files that are important, but not as extremely important, right? So the two files that are extremely important when it comes to what the React library is doing for us, again, are the index.js and the app.js. The index.js is the file that connects this JavaScript project to the HTML to eventually create the front-end experience that shows up in our browser for the React application. When you first create an application with the Create React App toolchain, it's very simple. In your terminal, you have to, after you install Node and npm, you are able to create a new application with React by using the Create React App command, like so. npx create React App, and then some project, right? So whatever your project name is, whatever you want your folder for your project to be called, you can name it that. And when you run this command in your terminal, it will create a number of different, it will create a project for you with a number of different files. That's what we're looking at here, is the end result of that process. Give me a thumbs up. I feel like most of us are cool with that part, right? The Create React App toolchain, we've launched a couple projects and we are kind of good on that front. Great, glad to see that. So the index.js is the file that gets created through those scripts that eventually connects all of our code together so that we can start writing React code and seeing it in our browser, right? The most important file outside of the index.js would be then the app.js. And as you can see, the app.js is referenced here on line 4, as well as on line 10. And we talked a lot about what all of these different lines of code are doing in the project, but for just a kind of quick understanding of it, this app is a file that we have in our project, the app.js, and inside of that file is what we call a component. And a component is essentially a bit of JavaScript code that represents visual elements that we want to render into the HTML of our web page. in this index.js, we are rendering our first component to the HTML. And that first component is called the app component that was referenced here on line 4. That component, the app component, is where we start writing most of our introductory code for the React application. And inside of that file is where we have been spending a lot of time writing different pieces of JavaScript and HTML like elements in order to render visual elements on the screen. So the app.js then is the place where when you start writing your React, right, is where you'll be creating your components to do different things related to showing visual elements on the screen, right? So I'm gonna do something to just allow for us to have a better conversation about this component hoo-ha, right? And just kind of go back to a place of starting from scratch a little bit, right? So I'm going to just clear out the app right now. Most everything that's in here I don't really need. And I'm just gonna rebuild it from scratch so y'all can see that the process and what's going on here, right? So whenever you have a component in React, right, you are going to create functions to represent that component. And a component can really be anything that you want to show visually on the screen. But as I mentioned, it's important for us to have at least this app component so our page can render how we expect it. So what I'm going to do is just create a new app component. So I'm just going to use the old function keyword function app. And inside of this function body, all I have to do is return some JavaScript for the component to reference as its visual elements. That JavaScript is written in a syntax called JSX. So I'm gonna just leave a comment up here and say, should return some JSX, right? And JSX is just a visual markup language for JavaScript that allows for us to essentially create elements that will be rendered visually on the screen. So it looks very similar to HTML, but it's JavaScript. And we kind of talked about that in our last couple sessions. And give me 1 second. Good people, I apologize. Okay. So, so this app is just responsible for returning some JSX. And so right now, what I will do is return a little div that has some text inside of it to just get the ball rolling for us right there. So inside of this div, I'm just gonna say H1, put a little heading and say, this is our main component. Cool. So now that I'm returning some JSX there, this is good. The only thing I need to do now is export this component so that it can actually be referenced in that other file. So if you recall in the index.js, we have a reference being imported for the app, right? And so in order for this import to work, I need to make sure that I export this function I just created so that it can be referenced in the other file. So saving this, right, will then allow for this app to be rendered on our screen. And when you are working with React, the React library, the Create React App library that we're using as our tool chain, allows for us to launch our application in a development server, which is helpful because it allows us to make changes to our application and essentially see those changes live. I started that local server in my terminal here just by running npm start command. And after you run Create React App for the first time, it walks you through how to actually start your server for your project. But once you run the npm start command, you have this project running in a local environment for you to reference on your browser. So on the browser, I could go to localhost 3000 and I should be able to see this app component that we just started working on. So here we go, we see it, dope. So the app.js represents our first component in our React project, right? And typically what we're going to be doing as engineers working on the front end, working in React, is using React components to build out a actual website for a client, for ourselves, for whatever purpose we're trying to solve for it. And so how we do that is by creating more components and referencing those components to essentially support us in making our work a little bit easier, right? So we started talking a little bit last session about some of what that extendability of what the JavaScript allows us to do when we start writing these components, right? Some of what it does is allows for us to add these programmatic elements to our projects, right? Allows for us to make it so that we can put data into places where our visual components can reference them, and allows for us to reuse components easier, to extend that reusability with programmatic logic. So we can add things like handling lists of data or even conditional things. So we're going to take a look at some of that more today in this practical example, and hopefully just build out a couple things that can make this feel more like a solid web application. And how I'll be kind of structuring this is going to be following a lot of what's in the quick start guide for React, the Create React app. Well, the quick start guide for React, period. And but I will be following it using the Create React app toolchain. So hopefully what they're talking about here, you can see how if you start a project with Create React app, how it might come up and how you might use it and whatnot. So first thing is, like we talked about, components, right? Everything in React kind of boils down to this idea of components. And components are essentially user interface objects that you want to put on a particular web application. Here it talks about how a component could be something as simple as a button or as large as an entire page. The idea is that in these functions, we're creating some visual element to render on the screen. So for the case of this, it's creating a new component called My Button, and My Button is legitimately returning a button for use in the application. So to just kind of show you this as an example, what we could do here is create a new component to just kind of demonstrate this. And let's just say My Button.js, right? And inside of here, I can actually create that button here. So all components will start with a capital letter. They have to. The React library will give you a warning if they don't. Essentially, the reason why is because any custom component, any component you're building for yourself should start with a capital letter. And anything that doesn't start with a capital letter will be treated like JSX, regular HTML elements. So if you're referencing HTML element, it will expect that that element will be lowercase. So for instance, there is a button element in HTML, right? So if we type HTML button W3, so we can get the W3 schools reference of this particular HTML, you'll see that the HTML has a button that you can use as HTML, right? The button tag. So anything that is referenceable as an HTML tag, you can reference in your React projects as JSX. So for this button, I could just say something as simple as return button, and then inside of this button, the way that the button tag works is you can create a button, and in between this HTML, you can put the name, like for the button to show. Essentially, the same thing can happen with this JSX. We have the button represented, and we can say something like My Button, right? To just kind of have some text there. And then again, because I will want to reference this, right? So just writing this component isn't enough when you're using Create React app. In order for it to show up visually on our application, we have to render it somehow, connect it somehow to the app, right? Because the app.js is the only component that gets rendered in the Create React app hierarchy right now. It has no reference or nothing related to it about the My Button. So just writing this isn't enough for us to actually see something on our application, right? In order for us to see this, I will want to essentially add this component to the to the DOM, right? And the DOM will be, in order to add something there, I need to make sure that it's getting rendered through a component that's already being rendered, if that makes sense. So because the app is the only component being rendered right now, if I want this to show up, I need to have the app be rendering this component, right? We can only really, let me say it like this before I say something that's not actually accurate. Because of the way Create React App is structured and the best practices of it, we are rendering one component to the actual DOM, the HTML DOM. That component, again, is the app. We saw this here in index.js in line 10, right? So it is, because this component is the one that we are saying is our main component, it then is the component where you'll be spending most of your time rendering other components that you want to show on the screen. So the app you can think of like as like your main project file. So anything you want to see should be connected to it in some capacity. So for instance, let's say I want to add that button here, right? Well, I can do that by first importing the button component that we created. First, let me save this so that it can be referenced. So I can import my button, right, from, and then I got to give it the path. So this is in / components, which is a folder I created, and then my button, right? So now I can reference my button and render it in the application by just referencing it in this JSX here in the app, right? So any component that you create can be referenced like so, right? You can just create a new JSX element with the name of your component and the closing tag, and that component will now be rendered on your screen. So we save this and we go back, and we should see when the code reloads in the server, our button is there now, right? So my button now is here, right? So this is great, right? And essentially, the value of components, as the documentation is talking about, is that you can now use that component in other places, right? So here you see, similar to what we're doing, we are rendering this component in our application. And ours application, because of Create React App, we use the app.js. And this is essentially trying to simulate something similar without it being specific to Create React App by showing you, hey, you can render your button too. The valuable thing that happens off of creating these components, much like we talked about, is let's say we are actually building out an application that requires multiple buttons. Well, now let's say I have this button with some very unique structure to it, or the button has some unique styling even, right? Now that this is its own component, if I want to ever use that button again, right, it's as simple as just rendering another version of that same component to the DOM, right? And so now I have both of those components rendering. So if ever I want to change them, right, I can change it in one place, which is the component file, right? And changing it there will change it everywhere, right? So that's one great benefit of using these components, is that not only is it reusable, but it will help you in your code organization to change elements that are common across your application, right? And oftentimes when you're building a web application, there are multiple places of your app that you might use certain similar visual elements, right? Think about any web app that you think about any website that you frequent that has a lot of information on it. I like going to the New York Times because you can see some of this reusability in how their website is structured. It really shows you how you might not want to create dozens of elements that are doing the same thing when a lot of what's going on here are similar, right? So if you look here, you can see some things that might be their own components. I challenge you to just take a look as I'm scrolling through this page and ask yourself, what might be a component that they would make that would be reusable in this type of application? Even starting at the top, you might see some, but drop in the chat what you think. Like, just as I scroll down, like what parts of this website might be structured as a component that they could reuse, right? So clearly they have a lot of articles and they have a lot of text, right? So what might be parts of this website that instead of building it that many times, I might want to represent as a single element that I can then reuse over and over again, right? One thing you might be noticing is as I'm scrolling, these sections kind of look very similar, right? Okay, image on the right, text article on the left, the number of minutes it takes to read, right? It's very similar on each of these, right? This might be a good example of like what might be a component on their website. Is this maybe big section featured on the site, right? And in that component, it might include some of these different pieces in order to show this thing in this repetitive way without having to actually repeat that many pieces of code. Here you can see a big list of elements. Again, just anything that looks reusable in this capacity could be structured as a component. And that's the point, right? We don't want to reinvent the wheel when we can essentially use those same pieces in different modes, right? Maybe a different example might be like a website, like for a SaaS application like HubSpot, right? If you look here, one thing that is really interesting about websites is that we like to keep design consistent. So you can see like, hey, they have this button for this orange button here. They have another orange button here, right? The same orange button here, right? So maybe instead of creating this button 6 times, right? Maybe we could create a single button that we can use across the board. So that goes back to this My Button example and maybe a practical place where that might take place in the actual web application. Does that make sense to you? Just giving these couple of examples, just give me a thumbs up so I know that you're seeing what I'm seeing and this is making some sense in a big picture context. Dope. Love that. Love to see that. Thank you so much. All right, so let's keep going on this quick start. So the React docs are talking about the same thing we talked about. Every component starts with a capital letter, but every HTML element is lowercase. And this is important because let's say we have a component that we call button with a capital B, right? This will still be valid because it starts with a capital B. But if the difference is capital B button is different than lowercase b button because lowercase b button represents that HTML tag. This capital B one represents our component. So it's very important to keep in mind that you can have components named similar to their HTML or JSX-like equivalent, but all of your custom components have to start with a capital letter. That's just how it works in rendering your components appropriately, right? So keep that in mind as you're building out your components. And yeah, that is how that goes. So here we see some of them talking about like the JSX, the exports, right? And creating some code in JSX and kind of starts getting into some more practical stuff. So let's actually start turning some of this application into more of a usable piece of code so that you can see, okay, well, how will we use React to make our applications a little bit more sophisticated as we're building out applications for ourselves? So what I'm gonna do is let's go back to the app.js and let's clear it up one more time to just kind of give ourselves a fresh start. And what we're gonna do is let's assume that we're building out a couple, just a little web application that is going to allow for users to essentially come to our application and see a list of messages that our other users maybe have left on the site or something like this, right? So what we're going to do is let's just rebuild this to kind of function like that, right? So what I'm going to do is just change this body and I'm going to say, I'm just going to name this what's up for now. And then you might know why I'm doing that just because of, puns. But the application here is going to just be allow for users to come and maybe see some different information based on what messages and whatnot show up. So to kind of walk this through making this a practical kind of page, I'm I'm going to just add some interactions in it that will allow for us to feel like, okay, like this actually feels like a little application. So what I'm going to do is underneath the heading, I'm just going to add a paragraph. I'm going to say, click to get started, right? So if we save this, go back to our React application, everything should load accordingly, and we should be good to go. One thing that you might be curious about, because I didn't touch on it earlier, and it is part of actually how React components work, is let's say we want to add some styling. Let's say I don't really like the fact that this text is kind of justified all the way to the left, right? And I want to add some styling. Well, typically the way we will add styling, you can add styling to your React components in a number of ways. One way that you see commonly used in the Create React app template, it kind of shows you this as well, is people will create individual CSS files to tie to those component files that they're creating. So the default application.js file came also connected to a defaulted app.css file that was created just for the template for us to see how the JS is connected to the app.css. So, but let's say I wrote this CSS myself and I said, hey, you know, I want to align all the stuff centered, and I want, you know, certain things like this header and whatnot to kind of exist, right? Well, all these classes are can be referenced by your components, right? Inside of your component files. In order to connect your application to CSS, you can, if it's a CSS file, much like the Create React app is showing us how to do, we can just import that CSS file directly in order to connect the CSS information to what our components look like here in terms of the elements here. So by reconnecting kind of the app.css that was written here and giving our divs, or you can do this with any element really, a class name, right? The class name attribute represents the class that would be in your CSS. So it's very similar to the HTML, but in HTML we say class, in React you'll say class name, but it will reference all of these the same way that you might expect it to in HTML. So right now I have inside of this CSS file a class that says, hey, anything with the class.app is going to have text align centered. So if I go ahead and just re-add that back to our component here, it will go ahead and add everything to the center, right? So connecting CSS can be really helpful for us just to make sure that our application is doing what it wants, what we expect it to do, right? So click to get started, right? Well, clearly I need a button in here. So great, maybe I can actually make a reference of my button here. So I can say, cool, let me put my button back in the mix and have it rendered here as a nice little gesture for ourselves, right? So dope. So I got this button, and now I might want to change this to be a little bit more focused on what is going on inside of my application, right? So clearly I might want the text to be something like log in, right? Or something like that, right? So there's two ways I can change this. One way is to just go and say, hey, let me go back to that component I created, the my button component, and change it here. So say something like, hey, you know, instead of my button with new text, I just want this to say log in, right? Or log in or something, right? The issue is if I ever use my button component again, right? Like maybe like, let's say, or sign up, right? If I imagine, right, I might want my button to be used again because it kind of represents the button for my application. But the problem is anytime now I reference this, I'm going to see, oh, well, every button has the same text. Well, that's not really going to be as helpful. That's not as reusable as I might like, right? Give me a thumbs up if you agree, right? You see kind of the conundrum here. If I change it there, now, anytime I reference that particular component, it's not going to be extendable. I can't actually use it in a reusable way, right? this problem comes up, and we as engineers want to find ways to fix this, because fixing this means we write less code. Writing less code saves us time, makes us happy, gets us paid. You know what I'm saying? So it is important for us to find ways to avoid these types of situations. So React luckily comes built with some features using JavaScript to help make this process easier. And what we can do is make use of them and use a concept called props. And we talked about this a little bit last session, right? So props are handy because we can use props essentially to pass data to a component for it to use when it is rendering its JSX. So props essentially are bits of data that we can just say, hey, component, this is some data for you to reference in your when you're rendering yourself, right? So what would be helpful, hypothetically, is if my button had essentially a text maybe property, and the text property had was able to kind of reference a little string of text that it could use as the text for the button when it's getting rendered, right? So here, it would be cool if I could just say something like log in, right? And then my button would be able to say something like, oh, cool. Does it say log in? Great. If not, I will say whatever the text was that the user wants me to show, right? So what's cool about React is doing literally this process is this simple. I can give any component a piece of data with whatever name I want to use to reference and some JavaScript, right? By using these curly braces, I can say, hey, I'm going to pass a JavaScript expression or JavaScript data to this JSX, right? Any JSX element can take some JavaScript in a similar way, right? So, and maybe we'll see some more examples of this in a couple of seconds. But my button, for instance, right? I could say, hey, I want my button to have I'm going to use the word attribute or property called text that is set to be this string called login. And then when I want to reference that bit of data, I can do so by extending my component's declaration by saying, hey, this component, or my component's definition, excuse me, to say that, hey, this component is going to receive some props. Props are a keyword in JavaScript and React that the React files will respond to know that you're referencing any of the data that was passed inside of your component when it was being rendered, right? So the props keyword is important. You have to add it to your function as a argument so that you can make use of that argument inside of your function. So again, like I said, anytime we want to access or pass JavaScript inside of a JSX expression, we can do so by wrapping the JavaScript element or function or whatever that we want to call in curly braces. So now I'm essentially saying, hey, the same button, right? My button is going to be a HTML button, but the text that's going to be referenced inside, now I'm going to actually reference it as JavaScript. And when we have a prop passed from a component for a component to use, you can reference that particular component's props by saying props dot and then whatever the name of the props are that you passed. So here we passed a prop text. So I'm going to say props.text, and props.text will know that I'm referencing this data that I passed into the component like so. So saving this and saving this will allow us to see that the button comes back and it's log in. If I did want to extend this app to say something more like, something like, or sign up for an account, right? I could use my button again and just change the text to be sign up. Oops, got to close it. Right, and now when I go back here, cool, right? I still have the same flow, but the button is now way more reusable, right? Thumbs up if you see why we did this and you see why it would be helpful to do this in your own kind of scenarios and situations. Dope. I like that. We running the numbers up. Everybody spamming the like button. I like that. I see that. I see y'all. We hacking out here. All right, cool. Dope. So this is great, right? This is cool. So right now I have like maybe the bare bones of like a little login welcome, a little welcome page. Like, let's not even call it a login page. We got a nice little welcome page, right? And this welcome page is allowing for a user to come and like, hey, click to get started, log in, or sign up for an account, right? Sign up. So now you might be wondering, okay, well, this is cool. What happens next? You know what I'm saying? What are we gonna do next? What are we gonna do next, Chief? Right? Well, it might be cool to actually start playing around with some of these buttons to show another really important concept about how the JavaScript that we're writing can make it so that our components can be very, very smart. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna actually wire these two buttons up so that they actually show us some other component. Maybe the login button, when we click it, shows us, hey, you're logged in. And maybe when the sign up button gets pressed, it says, hey, you know, sign up for an account, and shows us some of the things we might expect when you're signing up for an account, right? Of course, I might not do all the, you know, nice bells and whistles of like connecting it to a database and showing, are we logged in, woo up in the bam. But hopefully in what we're doing here, you can see how that can be achieved using React. So here's what we're gonna do, right? I always love to give myself a strategic plan when I'm thinking about what I'm going to achieve, right? So somewhere in my account above here, I just like to write sometimes, like kind of just like, what do I want to achieve? Well, what I want to achieve is I want to, you know, create a component that can show when a user presses login, right? And then also I want to create a separate component that can show when a user presses sign up, right? So this is what I want to do. And then I want to somehow, based on what button gets clicked, show the right component, right? So if login gets clicked, I want to see that login component. If sign up gets clicked, I want to see the sign up component. Give me a thumbs up if that makes sense, kind of what I'm hoping to achieve right now. Just keeping y'all on your toes, making sure y'all don't fall asleep on me. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to be hacking alone. I want to be hacking in community. We're here to hack together. You know what I'm saying? All right, lit. Okay, cool. So that is all what we're trying to achieve here. We got a nice little strategic plan, a little bare bones, you know what I'm saying? Measurable objective and all. So you know what we're trying to do here. Okay, so what we're gonna do is, let's do that. Build out these components. Well, we know what we gotta do to build the components out. We just need some new files. It is helpful sometimes, as you can see, clearly it's already been helpful to maybe create a new folder to store all of your components when you're working on a project like this. So sometimes what I like to do, especially in like VS Code, just right click, create a new folder and then name it whatever. So this is how I made the components folder before, right? I made a new folder like this. Right now, clearly I don't need that because I have it already, but I'm just showing you. Clearly, when you have a lot of components, it's great to organize them in a better way. So what I want to do is create a component that can show when a user presses login. Boom, let's do that. We'll up into bam, login.js. Wow, woo, function, login. Oh, we're trying to go so quick. Function, log in. Oh, return. We got return. Nice little component right here. Div, boom. Ooh. Oh, it didn't want to autocomplete. That's sad, but we're going to make it happen anyway. Speed racing. Okay, div and say log in, right? Boom. This is how fast we can make a new component in React, right? Export this component, save this, go back to our application, and I can automatically start using this, right? This login component can be used whenever I am ready to use it. So that is literally what it's like to build a new component. And we can create the same kind of thing for our other strategic task, right? Create another component for when a user presses sign up. So what I'll do here is create a new file, call it signup.js. Inside of here, I can do the same thing, but I will also make use of the different syntax for creating functions, just so you're aware of it, right? So we've been using the function keyword, which is the kind of the old standard for creating functions, but you also might see people use arrow syntax, which is more of the new version of writing functions in the latest versions of JavaScript. So you'll see kind of both in your experience here. So just export before I forget. Whoa. All functions have to do one job, return some JSX. So we'll return nice little JSX, put a little message here. And I literally will code my components just this simple, just to start, right? Hey, can I have the component say something when it shows up? And just to see that it's working, right? Maybe I will go ahead and sometimes I like to test it, right? So what I can do is, let me just comment out all of this. If you select all of anything you want to comment in your particular text editor, and then you hold like Command on a Mac or Control and press the / key, right? It'll group this all and make it a comment. So that's how I did that fast, if you're curious. But now that the app's kind of empty, I could do something just to test that these components are working, right? Import login. VS Code was trying to help me, VS Code, help me. I like that. Yeah. Make my life easier. Yeah. Import sign up, boom, cool. Now I can just test that these are working just by, like we did before, just rendering it, login, save this. Let's just see if it shows up, what we expect. Cool, nice little message there. Sign up, same thing, just test it. And boom, cool. We got these two components created. They're rendering, doing what we expect them to do. And we're good to go in that regard, right? Now we can use those components. Of course, I'd still want the app to show what it's showing here. We just got to figure out how to use these components in a more sophisticated way. So now we've done this. Step one, okay. Step two, yeah. Step three, based on what button gets clicked, show the right component. Okay, so now we're talking about some new stuff a little bit, but also getting into practical things, right? It is gonna come up that you're gonna have a button show, you're gonna have interactions on your web page. And based on what we know so far about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, we know that JavaScript is used to handle those types of interactions. React makes this process very simple because it allows for us to create those types of event handling functions pretty simply. So just to show you what I mean, let's actually wire up our button to just do something when it gets clicked, right? Because right now, when I click on this, nothing really is happening. So if I want, this is a question for y'all, pop quiz in the chat. If I want to change this, so anytime I click this button, right, something happens, which file should I go to first to try to change this? Is it A, the login component, B, the sign up component, or C, the my button component? What do y'all think? Drop it in the chat. You can say the name of the component or A, B, or C. Essentially, I'm gonna go and start tweaking these buttons to do something. Where should I go and do that? All right, third time's the charm. 3 people said my button. We'd go into my button. That's exactly where we want to go. So why would I want to do that, right? Well, if I want this button to do something and I want this button to do something, the best place for me to change anything to do that is that component, right? Because if I change it in this my button component, it's going to change it for those 2 files for me, right? So that is, again, why you want to structure your code as components. Because now, let's say I want to make it so anytime a button gets clicked, something happens. I can do that in one place, and now both of those buttons can react to those changes. That pun was intended. All right, so how can we get this button to register that is being clicked? Well, if you recall, in HTML, we have the JS DOM has events that it can respond to, right? I typed this weird like this, hoping that the W3 schools reference pulls up, but the MDN reference is just as good. But essentially, remember, JavaScript can respond to different events happening on the web. So here's an example in HTML, right? A button clicked and then some function happens. This is HTML, right? So everything in React is meant to be following what was standard in HTML, but to make it easier via JavaScript. So what we're going to do is similar. We're going to pass what's called a handler to our button to call whenever something happens when it gets clicked. Here you can see that in HTML, that event is called onClick, like this. And there's a number of events here. You can see them on the left-hand side of my screen that you can try to, you can respond to, right? If they can be responded to in regular HTML, they can be responded to in React. That's just a good rule to keep in mind, right? So clicks, clearly you pass this on click and then some function, and then that function gets called when it gets clicked, right? In React, it's a very similar process, except the casing of these attributes is different. Literally, most everything that you see in HTML land is the same in React, except you see how this on click is all lowercase. In JavaScript, we typically use camel case for everything, right? So if you're doing a tutorial, you're like, hey, how do I do drags and drops? And you say, oh, it's on drag is the handle, but it's all lowercase. Well, in React, it would be camel case, the same thing. So on click is still the thing we want to use, but in JavaScript, rather than it be like this lowercase, you see that it's capital C. So on click, right? And this basically is the event handling code for us to pass a function that will be called whenever whenever this particular component gets clicked, right? So what we're gonna do is just to show you kind of how these event handle things work. I'm gonna create a new function, and let me just do this above so it's easier for y'all to read it. I'm just gonna say handle click and handle click. I'm gonna just create a little function for myself here and handle click, right? So this is a little JavaScript function. Here, I'm going to make use of another cool function in JavaScript that is helpful for debugging and all types of stuff, which is the alert function. An alert function, you can pass a message in that will pop up as an alert. So I just like to do this sometimes when I'm testing. So I got a nice handle click, and when it gets called, it's gonna say clicked, right? So onClick is expecting me to pass a function into it for it to call. If I define the function outside like this, like it's a separate function, I can just reference it by referencing the name of the function like this, right? So whenever onClick gets called, this handle click function is going to get called. This is one way to do this, right? So essentially now, if I save this, I expect that whenever in our app we click one of these buttons, we get a nice little alert that says, hey, click, cool, great, amazing, wonderful. Both of these are being clicked on now, right? That's great. So we have the ability to respond to something going on with these buttons, right? So that's cool and that's helpful. It's making it a little bit easier for us to process some of what's going on in this application. Now, to keep it going, right? Well, before I keep it going, I like to keep it going. Thumbs up if you're still with me, right? You see what we did here. We have this nice little app, like got some couple different components going on so far, but hopefully this is all still making sense. We are just added the interactability for these components. So now anytime a my button gets clicked, it will run that same function to do something. Right now we're telling it to click to just alert us that it was clicked. So that's great. That's amazing. So cool. So this is dope. This is dope. We actually are in a good place. Let's keep it going and go back to what our strategic plan said we need to do. We want to, based on what button gets clicked, show the right component. Okay. So essentially, if this button gets clicked, we want to see the login kind of component, right? Otherwise, we want to see the sign up component. Now, of course, in JavaScript, in React, there's a lot of ways to do different things. And there's specific ways we could achieve this, kind of like what we would call routing. And routing is, but routing is a little bit more of an advanced topic, well beyond where we are with our current knowledge of React. But what we can do is use some basic JavaScript principles to make this possible. How might we do this? You might ask. How might we do this, Cam? How might we do that? Tell us how. Well, how we can do this is by way of leveraging conditionals in order to basically say something like, hey, if the button for login is being clicked, show this. Otherwise, if the button for sign up is being clicked, show this. Otherwise, show nothing, right? If you are familiar with a logical way that we could do if this, else that, well, what would you do in your regular programming language? Drop it in the chat. If I want to do some kind of conditional logic here, what might be the programmatic concept I use to make that happen? It's a something statement. I know y'all know the vibes, right? Basic programming 101, right? Real quick. What would we do, right? See some if else's. Somebody said ternary operator. Somebody said switch. Oh, y'all professional. Okay. Y'all don't need me. All right, we're gonna end the Zoom early. All right. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. We still gotta React, but yeah, all those things. Exactly. If else's, switch statements, ternary operators, conditional logic, right? All those things will help us achieve our goal here, which is, can we, based on what is happening, show one thing versus another thing, right? So what would be cool is if we could say something like, hey, if the user clicks this button, we want to show X. Otherwise, we want to show Y. Otherwise, we're going to show something else, right? So how can we add some of this logic to our application to at least know which button clicked us and what's going on? And, you know, as I'm building this, I see that maybe some of this might be a little convoluted, but I'm doing most of what I'm doing here to just give y'all practical kind of examples of how all of this works together. Of course, when you're architecting your app, you might structure your components completely different to make it a little bit more reusable or easier. So that was my financial advisor statement that, you know, all investment advice is subject to the risk of the market. But yeah, so we're gonna keep going with how we got it going right now. You know what I'm saying? So here's what we're gonna do. So whenever this button that is created that says login is pressed, we just want some way to know that that's what's going on. Otherwise, when this button for sign up is being pressed, we want some way for that to be to let us know what's going on as well, right? So what we're gonna do is we are going to make it so that these buttons, right? So now I can get rid of the login sign up page for now, right? So we have this button. My button right now is whenever a button gets pressed, it will handle a click, right? It'll tell us, hey, we're being clicked. Great. So what can we do now to basically allow for the app to know, hey, which button got clicked, right? Because now there's two buttons, right? There's two buttons right here. So what could we do in order to make it so that this component, right, this app component, which is what we call the parent component, can get notified whenever one of its children is doing something that we care about, right? So what we're gonna do is basically build a notification system to basically say, hey, this child component is telling us something as a parent, right? And how we can do that is using some of what we already know, right? So we can pass any data to a child component as props, right? We pass some text to the button, but there's way more types of data than just strings in JavaScript, right? Another type of data that might be useful is a function, right? Basically, we could tell this button, hey, I'm gonna give you a function and I want you to use it when I tell you to use it or whenever you wanna use it, basically. Just like we told it, hey, I'm gonna give you some text, you can use it however you wanna use it. You know what I'm saying? I'm a cool parent. Use it however you wanna use it, right? Let's do something similar for this button to essentially notify us when we've been clicked, right? That way we can ask it, okay, well, what was clicked? And it can tell us, right? So that's essentially the approach we're going to take based on just the structure of the code so far. Of course, like I said, if we architected this app a little bit differently, we might not need to do all of this. You know what I'm saying? Hack at your own risk. live hack at your own risk on a Zoom, on YouTube, you know what I'm saying? 7 o'clock, you know what I'm saying? At your own risk. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna do a similar thing like we did before in the other component file. We're gonna create a new function. So I'm gonna say, we're going to call this, dang, I'm trying to get a nice name that makes sense. We're gonna call this notify click status something, right? Now, hopefully that is kind of decent as a name for this function to see kind of what it's gonna do. So this function is just gonna notify us on the status of what got clicked, right? If something gets clicked, we wanna be able to be notified that it got clicked, right? So here, just to kind of make sure that this is working the right way, I'm just gonna actually make a console log and just say, what got clicked, right? So I have this function, right? Or you know what, just to make this a little bit smoother for us to see, I'm gonna actually make this, I'm gonna say something got clicked so that we know, hey, something got clicked. Right now we have the alert doing this, but the alert is happening in the button, right? So what we want to see is like, hey, can we make it so that this button, when it gets clicked, will tell us, hey, something got clicked, right? That's essentially the kind of flow we're going after here. So how can I do this? Well, just like I said before, we can actually pass data to this component that is beyond just text, right? We can actually pass an entire function as a prop as well. So that's exactly what I want to do. I'm going to say, I got to give the prop a name for it to use. So let's just say, I'm going to call it man, naming on the spot is the hard part. That's the hard part. I'm going to name it on button click, right? That way I feel like it kind of still is an easy to read kind of thing, right? So my button is our component. It has some text, and when the button gets clicked, something's gonna happen. Hopefully that makes sense in a grammatical way for all of us, right? I'm gonna make sure I add both the props for it to both, but what I'm gonna do is basically pass, again, right? Use the curly braces to pass JavaScript, right? I can pass, just like I passed the text before as a string, I can pass now this notify click status as a function. So cool, now, whenever this this child component uses this on button click prop, it's going to make sure that that function is going to respond with the notify click status that I have up here, right? So saving this and then go back to the button. All I got to do now is make use of that prop, right? So I can make use of this prop anywhere inside of this function body, right? Anywhere where the component is actually being declared, I can use the props so long as I bring it in as an argument. So originally I use it here in the return statement for the props.text, but I don't really need anything for the prop for the click notification to happen anywhere but really handle click, right? Because when this button actually gets clicked on, it's gonna call this function we already defined and it alerts us. We saw that earlier. So now I might just want to add something like props dot notify click. Oh, no. What was it, John, called? It was on, I forgot the prop already. Damn, that quick. On button click. So the prop is called on button click, right? So if I say props dot on button click, right? This is going to reference that prop that I passed in, right? Give me a thumbs up if you see what I'm saying, right? Because this is a prop that I created called on button click. When the component references this prop, it's actually going to reference the data that I told it to reference. Just like when we said props.text, it knew what the text was. Now when I say props.on button click, it's going to know that this is the data that I'm talking about. Give me a thumbs up if that makes sense to you. My bad if you did. I just missed it. You know what I'm saying? I just want to see. All right, cool. All right. Groovy. All right, cool. Double digits. We all right. All right, lit. So, cool. So because this is actually a function, right? On button click technically is a function as data. I actually want this to be called. So I can actually call this function here. So now whenever the handle click happens, not only will it alert us that it was clicked, it will call props.onButtonClicked. And when onButtonClick gets called, right, we know that onButtonClick is actually going to call this notify click status function that we created. And that's going to console log something got clicked. Very complex, but all kind of achievable using JavaScript and React. So let's go back to our application. I'm going to open up the inspector just to make sure that that console log, if that console log runs, that we're looking good here. So I'm going to open up the console and just make sure that that's around for the party. And cool, we're going to just go ahead and click to get started, log in. Okay, the alert happens. That makes sense, right? Because in the button, we said alert us, right? Okay. Now, after I press OK, we want to see in this console some magic. Y'all, class is over. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know what all these warnings are. Don't worry about this. But we do see our something got clicked. The warnings are kind of referencing just some other stuff going on in the React library, but not necessary for us right now. What would be terrible for us is if there were errors, but there's no errors. These warnings you don't have to worry too much about. The messages are sometimes helpful though to let you know kind of what's going on though. So as you can see, whenever we click on one of these Johns, right, it will do our alert and then we will see something got clicked. Same thing if I click sign up, right, something got clicked, called twice, perfect. So now we're in a great position because now our on button click can let us know that something got clicked, right? All we need to know now is what got clicked, right? What got clicked? Ooh, try saying that like 5 times fast. What got clicked? That was a tongue twister real quick. What got clicked, right? And we want to know that from the button. We want this to tell us what was it that got clicked. And so how can we do that, right? Well, these are functions. Functions can take in arguments. We can pass data from function to function, right? So this on button click function that's being called, right? What if we pass it some data? What if we say, hey, whenever this gets clicked, it's gonna just respond with props.text to just let us know what was the text of the button that got clicked, right? So now this component is still completely reusable, right? It just is gonna let us know what was the text of the button that got clicked, right? If I save this and we go back to the app, right? Whenever on button click gets called, we know it's gonna call notify click status. So we can almost say, hey, notify click status is gonna receive some text, right? The text, I'm just calling this text like a variable name, right? Text might be the name of the button that's getting called. So what got clicked, let's just say, hey, text to call this data that's gonna come back. And essentially, what you might be seeing this, right? I made a console log and you can console log multiple values if you separate them with a comma. So this console log will say what got clicked, and then it'll put text, right? And the text that came back from our on button click, which is happening here, where we're passing it here into the function. So little convoluted, little kind of functional baton passing. But what's cool about this is that, and what I'm going to do also is just get rid of that alert so that we don't have to waste time with it. Save this and go back to our little John, reload the page, make sure that this is all good, and log in. And so when I click login, cool. What got clicked? Login. Dope. What got clicked? Sign up. Dope. So this is actually really dope, right? So now, not only are these two buttons actually responding, I also know which button got clicked based on the text that gets passed back, right? So that's great because at no point did I go in and do something very specific to any of these buttons. I just legitimately, all I did was add the logic for any button to tell us what was clicked, right? Especially to just respond with the text of the button that got clicked. That means anywhere else that we use a button, my button, we could still do this similar kind of process, right? So now that I know what's coming back, right? now that I know what's coming back from those buttons being pressed, right? The last thing that I need to do in order to kind of make this do what I expect it to do as a particular component, right, is I need to now, based on what button gets clicked, show the right component. This is why it's helpful to have a little strategic plan, because now I can reference, okay, well, what's my goal now, right? Well, my goal now is to just, based on what button gets clicked, show the right component. First, I have to figure out, how will I know what button gets clicked? That's what we did all of this for, right? Notify click status is a function we passed into the button for it to then tell us when it got called, hey, what button got clicked, right? So just to put this here, I'm gonna just say sends data back to the parent via props, right? So what's cool about the function as props method is that you can create this kind of notification like system where you can say, hey, not only can we use props to basically say, hey, I'm passing data to a child, right? The app component passing data to the my button component via props like this, right? I can also say, hey, the child might send me back data using the same prop that I gave it. So when we want a child to give us back some data, it's helpful to use this kind of like notification system kind of thing where we say, hey, create some function that we're going to pass to the child as a prop. And when that child is ready to send us back that data, it'll just call that prop and pass whatever data we need here, right? This system is a very common design pattern in React when it comes to sending data from one component to another component, or more specifically, sending data to a component and then sending data back to the original component. If that makes sense to you, give me a thumbs up, because that, like I said, is a pretty important design pattern that you'll see often when you want two components to kind of share and exchange data with one another. Cool, I appreciate that. Appreciate all y'all dropping your thumbs. Appreciate that.
Professor.
Go ahead.
I follow the concept and understand everything that you're doing, but I guess it's just for me that since nothing has like a data type or anything is like specifically typed out,
yeah,
is just kind of
it's trip you out.
Yes.
Oh yeah, I feel that. Yeah, that's one of the differences I think in working with JavaScript versus working with like a strongly typed language like JavaSys. So this is common. I think that the idea is that a lot of this code that we're writing is declarative, right? So it's not implicit, like, hey, this is gonna send a string and the string's gonna do this, do that, and the third, right? It's more like, hey, we're gonna be sending data from one place to another. That data will be passed as it is, and you just are writing your code and writing your components to receive what you expect to receive yourself, right? Of course, like the benefit of that is clearly the code is a little readable, easy to kind of follow logic, like just reading it. But like you said, seeing what data is coming back and what all is happening within these little variables and whatnot is still pretty difficult. And again, that's one of the reasons why people have been very interested in TypeScript as a extension of all of what we're doing here with JavaScript and React, but adding that extra layer of strongly typed kind of data so that you can keep a better track of what's going on with all the data as it's moving around. Because anything can happen as it's moving around. It could throw stuff off, and you might expect something to come back that's not coming back, and it could definitely throw things off for us. But it's a great point, and definitely something worth considering so that we can keep in mind, like, how do you build your apps to be thoughtful of that process, and knowing that, hey, at the end of the day, we want to keep track of the right data at the right times. I appreciate that. What I want to do, we got a couple minutes left. Let's finish this up, and just by way of actually solving this last piece, right? Which is we want to show this right component now. So now that we have this notify click status is coming back with the actual text of the button that's being called. Now what I might want to do is like show the appropriate component next, right? That's kind of what I want to do, right? Is like after we know what's going on in the text, right? Show the appropriate component based on that, either log in or sign up, right? So how we will do this, right, is like we talked about before, use a little bit of this kind of conditional logic to essentially put a component on the screen that is based on what we hope to what component do we want to show, right? So okay, so now is a great time for me to introduce one concept in React that is another concept that's very important in addition to props. So we kind of talked about props. We save data, we can send data to a component, and then we also can, if we send a function, we can also receive data from another component. But sometimes what we want to do is change what we are seeing in a component, like essentially have the component show something different based on things going on within that component itself. So an example of this is right now, right? When this button gets clicked, we actually want this component to change and show something different, the app component right now, right? Right now, there's not really a good way to do that, right? Essentially, we want a case where, okay, if no button has been pressed, we want to show this nice little welcome message, right? If the login button gets pressed, we want to show the login component. If the sign up button gets pressed, we want to show the sign up component, right? Those are kind of the three states of the app right now. And it's funny, I didn't do this intentionally, but that word state is a key element here, right? At different parts of our website's use, right? There's different states of the application. Like right now, the state of the application is, hey, the default state, you could say, right? Nothing's been pressed. We're just here on default. Nothing really is going on yet. We want to show this, but once this button gets clicked, login, we want to change to the state that the login button has been pressed, right? Now login's been pressed, so we want to see something different, right? Now sign up's been pressed, we want to see something different, right? Those ideas of like state come from the events and the interactions or the data transfers happening on our websites at any given point in time. And we can use that same concept that we're just talking about mentally actually in React. There is a ability for us to use, again, I didn't mean to say it like this, but there's an ability for us to use state in our React application. And it is very simple. It's so simple that the name of the function we have to use to do it is actually called use state. So let's show you how to use state in your React applications. So whenever you want to use state in a React application, the first thing you need to do is import the use state hook from the React library. So the import statement looks something like this, where we're saying import, we see curly brace, and we see use state from React. The reason for this curly brace is because the React library has a lot of different components and files and data that you can use inside of, that you can access, right? So when we do an import to the React library, you don't sometimes want to import everything from the library. You want to import just a specific function or a couple functions, right? And using the curly brace syntax here allows us to specify that we're going to import the use state function from React, right? This use state function is literally the only thing we need in order to add this concept of state to our applications. And state basically is this idea, like we just talked about, where we might want to track data at different moments in time in our application and change things based on that data change, right? So for instance, we might want to have a scenario where we have a basically whenever a button is whenever a button is clicked, right? We might want to keep track of what button got clicked, right? So we might want to set, hey, what button got clicked, right? And as a default, right? As a default, that button might start null, right? It might be like, hey, we actually don't have any button getting clicked right now, right? And there's a null value there. The value doesn't exist because no button's been clicked. Well, if the button gets clicked, right, we might want to set which button got clicked. And when we set that button that's gotten clicked, we might want to be able to change what we see based on what button was clicked. Right? This essentially is how the use state hook allows us to set something like this logic up. Basically, we say a variable that we're going to use to hold the state data that we care about, right? Which button got clicked, right? And then a function that we can call whenever that button actually does get clicked, is the second argument here. And once, and whatever the default value is going to be. So we're going to default it to null to start with. This syntax might look a little crazy because it's like, oh, what is this, an array? Or what is this? Well, what we're doing is called destructuring. And the destructuring syntax is essentially us creating these pieces of data off of what the use state function returns. So the use state function returns a value that has these pieces of data for us to reference, essentially. And so this syntax is essentially saying, hey, you know, take the button clicked and the set button clicked objects from the use state function. A little tricky JavaScript, but as you see referenced in like the React docs or anywhere, you'll see that the syntax to create a state value is structured similarly to this. But more than just kind of what's going on with the syntax, let's actually use it. And I think in seeing it being used, it will make a little bit more sense, right? So just like we talked about, right? We have the ability to, we want the ability to know what buttons got clicked. We already got that with our notify status situation here. The only thing we want to do now is allow our application to basically change itself based on what button's been clicked, right? So essentially what would be cool is if, you know, maybe I could have a function or something that's like render page. I'll call it render page or something like this, right? And then in this function, what would be cool is if I could do something like if, you know, login was pressed, right? Like return the login component, right? You know, else like, you know, if like sign up was pressed, right? Return sign up, right? Otherwise, just return, you know, our default kind of application as we're kind of used to it, right? It would be cool if we could do this. And the reality is we actually can do this using JavaScript and React, right? So if login was pressed, right, we just want to know, we want some way to know which button was pressed outside of this one function. That's the big thing, right? We know it here in this function, but there's no good way for us to basically say, hey, how can I get this text in this function, right? I could, in a way, bring some of this logic up, but that would just create a little mess of things. It would be great if I could just somehow have this same text that comes back referenceable elsewhere in my app. Most times there's a reality is that we want that kind of ability to access data at different points in our component and see that data change at different points in our component. And that's exactly what state allows us to do. So here in the notify click status where we're getting back that text, right? The text comes back after it's been clicked. So now what I want to do is basically say, I want to set the button clicked based on the text, right? So set button clicked is a function. I know it's kind of hard to know that when you haven't used the state object ever, but this second argument in this weird syntax is a function that takes in data. And essentially that data is saved in this first object so you can reference it. So now I can make a reference to button clicked elsewhere. So here, for instance, if I want to check if the login button was pressed, I could say something like if button clicked is equal to, right? Login, right? That was the name of our first text button, right? I want to return that login component, right? So what I'm going to do is return login, right? Else, you know, if it's an else if, it's more like this, right? Else if button clicked is equal to sign up, right? Was it like that? Yep. Sign up, then return the sign up component, right? If none of these work, right? If none of these, then I just want to return the, well, based on how this works, right? If this is the case, then this will be, well, let's do it like this so that this actually can work the way we expect it. So if button was clicked, we're gonna log in, else, excuse me, else if this was clicked, right? We're gonna return the sign up, right? Else, right? If nothing else, right? Else, what we want to do is return kind of our default little code, right? This kind of stuff, this little message, welcome message stuff, right? So what's cool about React is we can use this conditional logic actually as the means for returning our application. So how I can do this, right, is what would be helpful is instead of having all this stuff we have right now, this message here, just kind of just sitting in the app, it would be great if this was actually its own component, because now we can reference it as its own component. So I'm gonna do that real quick. You know, y'all saw how fast it is. I'm gonna just create a new component. I'm just gonna call it welcome.js. And welcome.js is going to literally just return our information that we have here. So I'm just going to create a function. I'm going to call it welcome. And I'm going to return a div that has that information in there, right? The only thing I need to do to make this work is clearly we're still making a reference to my button in that notify click status function. Man, well, let me think. Let me think, because I'm saying y'all know the vibe, so I don't want to. Okay. I can't. Okay. One thing we could do is clearly separate this out as its own function, and as its own component. And hopefully, from what we've done so far, you see how we could do this by way of just creating a new file for this. But for two reasons, I want to show you how we can do this another way. So instead of creating an entirely different function, right? Let's say I do want to return this, but I don't want to have it in its own component for some reason. And I can explain one reason why I do this in a second, right? I can literally just return to JSX, right? So the JSX here, I can reference it as, I can reference this JSX here the same way I did in the return statement, right? Kind of just like have some JSX that's a div with all this stuff that we already have, right? I know this is kind of hard to read, so let me save this, right? Essentially, right, I've taken that JSX and I'm saying, if this button was clicked, we'll return this. Else, if that button was clicked, we're going to return this. Else, we're just going to return what we originally had down here before, right? So now if I call render page, right, which is this function we created, right? Now this function should make it so that it's going to return whatever is the right JSX that we want, right? If the login page was, if button click is login, we're going to see the login page. Else, if button click the sign up, we're going to return sign up. Else, we're just going to return this kind of default information where all this stuff kind of exists, right? So if we go back to our page now, right, everything refreshes. I'm going to click login and cool. Now I see the login page. I go back because I need to, I don't have the ability to go back yet, right? If I go back, refresh the app one more time, if I click sign up, I get the sign up page. If I refresh to just see that one more time, cool. Clearly, if nothing is clicked right now, I get the default welcome message. This is happening because of the conditional rendering that's going on here. Conditional rendering is just a big word to describe this concept, which is we can render different elements based on logic, conditional logic, right? And so clearly this whole function render page is conditional logic. They all said if else's are conditional, is how we do conditional things. So here I'm saying, hey, if X is the case, right? Show this. Else if Y, show that. Otherwise, show this, right? And this was the original component, like this is the original JSX, I should say, that we had in the app.js. Now we replaced the app with literally just a function. And that function is going to handle the rest. It's going to look and check the state to see, hey, are we in the state where the login button was clicked, or are we in the state when the sign up button was clicked? Otherwise, we're in a state where nothing was clicked. And if you remember with the state, we set it originally as a default to null to say, hey, nothing was clicked. So we're clearly going to, because nothing was clicked yet, it's null. And that is how we can have this logic respond the way we do. And that's it. Now we got that going. So now if I want, right, I can extend these two components, the login component and the sign up component, to start doing way more, things I would expect. Maybe in the sign up component, I could bring a form in here to let people sign up. In the login component, let's just assume that somebody typed their information in and logged in. Then maybe what I showed them here actually is like the dashboard of stuff, and they see all their messages or something if we're building our messages app, right? So that's literally what would be able to be done with just a bit of these, just extending these components a little bit more in what we're doing. You might be wondering, well, why didn't you end up doing the welcome component as its own thing? And real quick, I'll explain to you why, right? As soon as I pasted this in here, I noticed one thing that was going to have to happen in order for us to make this work, right? Which is the fact that, well, two things that needed to happen to make this work. The first thing is I needed to be able to import, my button, right? Which is pretty simple. I can import my button from the components folder. Since it's in the same folder, welcome in my button, the reference is the same, like, hey, reference my button from this folder. But the second thing that I needed to do outside of just exporting this is, as you can see, right, this on button click is expecting that notify click status function to be defined here, right? And notify click status was that function that we created earlier to essentially allow for us to respond to when things got clicked. It also changed the state here, right? So the issue was, if I copy this function over, right? Well, now, right, of course, like, this is cool, but now I also have to bring in the state here, because the state, this set button click doesn't exist in this particular file yet, right? So I would have had to essentially restructure a lot of stuff to make it so that the state existed here. And by restructuring that the state existed here, I would have had to also maybe pass some props or something from the welcome component back to the app for it to actually process everything that I would have expected. All similar to what we did, but now I'm just moving which component is storing the data and what component needs it, right? The app needs that data, but now instead of it happening all within the app like it was before with this function and the state in the app, if I move all that logic to a different component, now I just need to create a way for this component to share that data to the app, right? Which is what we literally did earlier, right? Passing props and sending it back, but I knew I was going to run out of time if I had to do it that way. So, executive thinking as a dev, you got to sometimes pick and choose what you can do and what you can't do based on the circumstances. And by doing that, we ended right on time. So appreciate y'all for rocking with me. Hopefully this is a great intro to some of the concepts in React. Of course, if you have some questions, stick around for a little bit. Otherwise, I'll see y'all next time. Got some cool stuff for y'all planned in the next couple of sessions. So I